Welcome back to ClearCut. I'm Michelle Makori, and you may have noticed I was away all of last week. I was at the Context Leadership Summit in Las Vegas, where I got to hear from some of the most important voices from the worlds of finance, politics, economics, and defense. And one of the people I spoke to was former Secretary of Defense and CIA Director Leon Panetta. I asked Secretary Panetta about Russia, China, and America's role in Syria.
I have always believed that the United States ought to play a bigger role when it came to Syria. We did initially say that Assad should come down. We said we were going to try to support the opposition forces. Unfortunately, we never really had a clear strategy as to what the United States was going to do in Syria. President Trump, to his credit, did take steps to try to deal with what Assad did on chemical weapons, and I commend him for doing that. But I think we have to look at the larger picture here, which is that Iran, Russia, and Assad are now working together to basically create a Syria that would, in essence, be an adversary of the United States. And we cannot afford to have Syria be that kind of adversary in that part of the world.
So, Secretary Panetta, how do you do that without risking a direct confrontation with Russia?
Well, the most important way to do that is to build a strong coalition of countries that will work with the United States to implement the policies I just talked about. That means we need to have the moderate Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, and others. Israel ought to be part of that coalition. Our allies in Europe ought to be part of that coalition. Building a strong coalition that will not only confront Iran, that will not only confront ISIS, but also work together to try to bring stability to Syria.
So a NATO for the Middle East, if you will.
That's right. A NATO of the Middle East is a good way to frame it.
I want to focus on Russia now and this renewed Cold War that seems to be taking place. Do you see this becoming a lot frostier, or are we headed for some kind of escalation and heating things up?
I think we are in a new chapter of the Cold War. I think that Putin, for whatever reason, has read weakness on the part of the United States and on the part of our allies in Europe.
With the previous administration?
I think it began with the previous administration. I think it probably continues now with this administration. And as a result of that, they're taking advantage of it. They went into the Ukraine, they went into Crimea, they went into Syria. They conducted the kind of attack that we're aware of on our election process in 2016. They're continuing to conduct cyber attacks. I think Russia continues to represent a real threat to the security of the United States. And the problem is, in order to deal with a Putin, you've got to deal with them not from weakness, but from strength. So we have to make clear to Russia, where are the lines that we will not allow them to cross? That is an important step to take, because they have to know that we are serious about restricting the kind of aggressive approach they've taken over these last few years.
And is that line potentially going to have to be drawn in Syria? Is Syria going to be perhaps the proxy war for this keeping Russia in place situation?
I would draw it in a number of places. First, I would draw it in Europe with NATO to make very clear to Russia that any kind of aggressive act to go after any of their former Soviet Union republics, we would consider an attack on the rest of Europe.
Nothing's happened with the Crimea situation, really.
Well, I understand that, but for a NATO country, if they went into Hungary or to Poland, then you could implement Article 5 of the NATO provision, which would have us saying to Russia, we will not allow you to do that. And I think with regards to Syria, I think we have to make clear to them, building the kind of coalition I talked about, make clear that we are not going to allow Russia to dominate where Syria is going in the future, that we intend to make sure that, that we will support opposition forces there, and we will support the ability of the Syrian people to determine their future, not Russia, not Hezbollah, and not Iran.
You mentioned the threat of Russia. Is Russia the biggest threat to the U.S. right now, in your opinion? What is the biggest threat to security for us?
We are living at a time when I have never seen as many flashpoints in the world since World War II. We're dealing with ISIS and the continuing threat there. We're dealing with the Middle East and failed states in the Middle East like Syria. We're dealing with Iran. We're dealing with North Korea. We're dealing with China. We're dealing with Russia. We're dealing with cyber attacks that could threaten our stability in the future. We're dealing with a series of potential threats that are out there. Needless to say, because of Russia being a nuclear power, we are obviously very concerned about that situation and the potential of some kind of great power conflict. That would be serious. But at the same time, we have to worry about these other flashpoints. What's the approach to dealing with that? The approach is for the United States not to pull back from leadership in the world, not to say this is about America first and the rest of the world can take care of itself. The only way we're going to do that is if the United States provides leadership, working with our allies to be able to develop strategies to deal with all of these flashpoints. That's the only way we're going to be able to do it.
Are you concerned about China from a military security perspective as it is expanding its military and bolstering its spending and its actions in the South China Sea and such? How high on your list of threats is China?
Well, I had the opportunity to meet with President Xi when I was Secretary of Defense. And my sense, I don't put President Xi in the same box that I do President Putin. I think President Xi is concerned about China, first and foremost, concerned about the economy there, concerned about the ability to provide for all of their citizens. And so I'm a believer that the best way to approach China is to communicate with China and to work on our economic relationships, work on our military relationships. I did that when I was Secretary of Defense. We had a very good relationship. I think we have to make clear to China that at the same time they have to abide by international law like everybody else. And so with regards to the South China Sea, we have to say to them, we will not tolerate any country interfering with freedom of the seas and our ability to have free transit there. And I think by maintaining a strong Navy presence in the Pacific, by maintaining a strong military presence in the Pacific and showing them that we are a Pacific power as well, I think that's the best way to deal with China, is to make clear that we will deal with them, but from strength.
How do you make that clear?
You know, when I talked to President Xi, he raised the concern about our repositioning Navy power to the Pacific. And I said to them, we are a Pacific power. We care, frankly, about a lot of the same issues you do. We care about terrorism. We care about North Korea. We care about the ability to have free trade. We care about economic strength. And President Xi said to me, you're right. We want to produce peace and prosperity in the Pacific. I said, if that's your goal, then the United States will be with you.
And Secretary Panetta, before we let you go, we have to ask how the walnut farm is doing. What's the latest?
Well, the walnut farm is still there. I still get on my tractor and work there. When I left Washington, I said I was leaving Washington to go work with a different set of nuts. And that's true.
Washington's even nuttier than ever now.
It is. I'm afraid that's true. And unfortunately, those nuts are much more dangerous than the ones I work with.
But the nuts are growing well.
They are doing well.
And that was my interview with Leon Panetta at the Context Leadership Summit. Context is a conference leader in the alternative asset management industry. And my thanks again to the Secretary for taking the time to speak with me.